समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया.
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
अब समझा.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to a fresh new episode of Geopolitics with Swasti, where Swasti Rao, our consulting editor for international and strategic affairs, takes your questions, dear subscribers, on geopolitical developments around the world. Now, Swasti, before we begin today's episode, I would like to begin from a compliment for you from one of our subscribers, and then we'll take his question, where he says that please accept his compliments for the brilliant show, which has the best researched take on geopolitics by you.
Thank you so much.
And on that note, I will take his question, where he asks you to help break down how the Europeans are planning to now militarize Ukraine in case the US assistance weans off. He also has a separate question along similar lines, where he says the recently held Oval Office meeting turned out well for Europe. But do you think there will be a ceasefire?
So thank you so much first for the compliment and your question as well. And as you know that we always try to include as many questions as possible. So, but there's always a limit to time, and sometimes we're not able to take all. But then please do consider becoming the members of the print if you haven't already done it, so that we can take your questions. Now to this question, I think this is the buzz right now. This is the talk of the town, which is the round 2 of the Oval Office meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump, which was followed by almost 7 European leaders sitting down with Trump and Zelensky to discuss the future of the Ukraine war. And just to cut a long story short, because I recommend you watch the latest Cut the Clutter that I have done, along with the Shaker, where we sort of discuss these things in detail. But to your to the other part of your question about when whether this will be able to put down a ceasefire or put together a ceasefire or not, see, my reading of the situation is that the ground reality is much more complex than what really meets the eye. And what usually happens is that the farther you are away from a theater, the more simplistic, one's
seems.
understanding of it becomes. So the ground reality is far more complex, because if there was any other way that Donald Trump and President Putin could have bilaterally done a ceasefire, it would have happened by now. But you did see that a few months ago when an attempt was made, it broke down in 4 hours, 5 hours, flat. So what we know is that it is easier said than done. Donald Trump himself alluded to it when he said that out of all the wars he has mediated and tried to mediate, and of course there is a reference made to India, Pakistan as usual, I don't know the nth time. I think he himself alluded to the fact that Ukraine war has turned out to be the toughest to end, while he, when he took office, thought that this would be the easiest to end, and this is something that he said again and again. So I personally do not think that going by what happened recently, of course it is a huge step forward. That is also something that I argued in my column, that do not expect too much from Alaska meeting, but if it is able to put together the necessary steps forward, that itself would be a huge progress. So it is the first time that you saw that all relevant stakeholders were involved in that talk, and to my mind that itself is a watershed change from how things were 6 months ago, when it looked as if Europe and Ukraine have no agency. Because my argument has been that even though Russia is the bigger military power, but because Europeans themselves have made massive transformations in the way they are supporting Ukraine and militarizing themselves, and also trying to compensate for the void which has been left after Biden administration has gone, Europe has actually put itself in a central position today. And even though it does not hold all the cards, but you cannot talk about a sustainable peace in Ukraine without having the Europeans on board. So
Right.
it is a step forward, but I do not see a peace deal or a peace negotiation or a ceasefire happening immediately. I think we are still away from it, but at least we are on the right track in the right direction. So congratulations to Mr. Donald Trump for that, at least. Now, about the more detailed part of his question, which is that what exactly is the EU and NATO doing? I think that's a very good question because the general perception, Devdatta, is that the US is still providing the lion's share of military assistance to Ukraine. Now, while this was true, and as the graph on the screen can also tell you that while this was true, especially during Biden administration, it has not been the case with the Trump administration. In fact, the Trump administration has not given a new aid to Ukraine, I mean, of any significance. And in fact, it was only in May 2025 that the Donald Trump administration actually allowed for the sale of weapons to Ukraine. So, what is happening right now, if I were to just cut a long story short, what is happening right now is that yes, the US assistance or US role is important because there are many, many weapons that are coming from the United States. And of course, right now, you don't really have a short term substitute for it, number one. Number two, the US is extremely crucial for its role in giving intelligence and also the role of Starlink. And in fact, Georgia Meloni mentioned that when that meeting was taking place, that the Starlink is something which is very crucial for Ukraine. And frankly, the Europeans themselves cannot substitute for anything like that in the short term. But despite that, Europeans have been the one that have been footing the bill for most of the purchases of what weapons are being used by Ukraine, especially the American weapons. So America is not giving any military assistance to Ukraine anymore. America is selling weapons to Ukraine, which are footed, the bill for which is footed by the Europeans. Okay, so this is the difference that has happened. And there is another very important point, which is not usually talked about, is that among all the weaponry that is being used from Ukraine's side, 40 to 50%, if not 50, but then 40 to 45% of that is actually coming from the Ukrainian defense industry alone. Okay.
Right.
And when we talk about the Ukrainian defense industry, again, a common perception is that it's only producing drones, where, of course, they've become probably the world's most leading innovators in drone technology and drone military technology. And in fact, if you remember, Zelensky very intelligently pitched for a $50 billion worth of drone deal with the United States, where Ukrainian-made drones would be sold to the United States in lieu of all this transaction that has been happening anyway. So the drone is something that everybody knows about, the drone technology, the drone attacks, and Ukraine champions it, the first-person view drones, etc., kamikaze drones, the Ursula drones, the Baba Yaga drones, the Magura drones, etc. What people do not talk about enough is the missiles. In fact, it was only on the very day that President Zelensky was supposed to meet Donald Trump, in the very day Ukraine unveiled its first cruise missile, which is called the Flamingo missile, which has a range of about 3,000 kilometers, etc. So missiles is another thing that Ukraine produces quite, I would say, impressively. Not just that, but also the Neptune missiles, and there's a whole host. So Neptune, and so those missiles. And third is about the howitzers. And howitzers, in fact, is something that we don't study enough here, because today Ukraine makes more howitzers than entire Europe combined. So the Ukrainian monthly capacity of making howitzers is 40 howitzers per month, which is exactly identical right now to Russian capacity of producing howitzers, which is also 40 per month. So what I'm trying to say is that while Europeans are doing their bit, it is difficult for them to do it. They have put together several instruments like the European Peace Facility, the Ukraine Facility. In NATO, there's something called a Comprehensive Assistance Package. Then there are different, bilateral, security treaties which have defense industry cooperation. So they have different instruments, and they are also actually using the interest earned on the frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. So there is a whole host of things which are happening, and which didn't start now, which actually started ever since Donald Trump was to become the president. Because if you remember, there was this very interesting buzzword 6 months ago, which was called Trump-proofing. So all these different initiatives are actually parts of Trump-proofing that Europe had started, thinking of the worst case scenario, which has come true for them. Okay, so Europeans are doing it, and Ukraine is also doing a lot of it itself. But if you ask me that what is the conclusion of this, is this going to be the game changer? Now, like I said initially in my remarks, that it basically gives some cards to Europeans and to Ukrainians, but considering that time is a vector, and Europeans are, especially the entire continent, is put together on a very social welfaristic model. It is not the same as saying that Europe doing its bit now and spending on its own security and enabling all these weapon purchases for Ukraine, etc., is enough to make Ukraine win the war. It is probably enough to make Ukraine stay afloat, but it is not enough to
Make them win the
for
war.
Ukraine to win the war, and that is the reason why we need some kind of a agreement or some kind of a ceasefire, because this cannot go until eternity. Now, the counter to that exists, which says that the UK intelligence said that Russia will also start to feel the heat towards the end of 2026, which is also true because Russia is in a war economy mode. But how can you not acknowledge the fact that Russian military industrial capability and the capacity to withstand huge losses is far more? So you have to be more realistic. So not a ceasefire anytime soon, but again, this war cannot go on forever, and there is a limit to how much of these efforts, what kind of a difference can they make. But having said that, it is true, and I stand by my argument that no lasting solution can be brought to Ukraine unless you have Ukraine and Europeans on board. Because even if a hurried peace deal were to be struck, basically what you will see is that a guerrilla style of fighting will continue. So nobody wants that, and it has actually, Russia doesn't want that either. Everybody wants something which can stay for a while, and for that the stakeholders need to be there, whoever has the agency, and I think Europeans and Ukrainians both have agency.
With that very comprehensive and insightful answer, Swasti, we move on to the next question by our subscriber Venkat Bharat Reddy, who asks that what is the Sudarshan chakra that Modi ji talked about during Independence Day speech?
Yeah, I think that was one of the key takeaways of Prime Minister's speech this year on 15th August. So I think the mission Sudarshan Chakra is, in many ways, it is a continuation of how India is making all these efforts to strengthen its security infrastructure and also ensure a kind of a comprehensive, multi-layered defense strategy, because the threats are evolving, okay? And this is, of course, all coming after post-Operation Sindoor, how we're trying to calibrate. Now, what it aims to do is that it aims to integrate advanced surveillance, it aims to have better cyber protection, it aims to have better physical defense mechanisms, okay, to safeguards the people, the territory, the critical infrastructure, etc., etc. And Prime Minister Modi, gave an outline of this. Now, at the heart of the Sudarshan Chakra is a kind of the Project Kusha. The Project Kusha is basically our indigenous, so to say, in many ways you can say a parallel to the S-400. But the part that we do not know yet is that how is this going to work out, because Project Kusha is also touted in the future. I mean, it is going to come sometime in the future. It is being made by DRDO. So we are aspiring to have a very comprehensive layered kind of an air defense, which is very well connected and integrated with our own, say, S-400s, okay, etc., which is the Project Kusha. But having said that, right now we do not really have an outline or a blueprint of how exactly are we going to do that, because no details have been disclosed. So what we know, for example, you may have heard that it says that this is going to be India's own Iron Dome, and this is going to be India's own Golden Dome. So Iron Dome is an Israeli thing, as you know. Okay, Golden Dome is an American Donald Trump's baby, where he wants to put assets in the space and he wants to link them all with his with America's, air defense, which is anyway the most formidable in the world. But long and short is that, please understand, Iron Dome, when we talk about Israel, now Israel is a very, very small territory. And if Iron Dome covers the entirety of Israel, now just imagine India's geographical vastness, and how do you put together a system that is going to cover India in the same way as Iron Dome covers Israel, is number one. So there, I think that size becomes a bit of an issue. And when you start comparing it with something like a Golden Dome, now Golden Dome is very, very expensive. In fact, the real cost of Golden Dome, frankly, has not really been worked out. I mean, that's why most people say that this is more aspirational than anything, but still it's there, and Donald Trump is very, very keen on it. So from India's perspective, we are perhaps looking at something which is not as expensive and yet effective and yet covering the entirety of India. So I think this is a very futuristic thing everything, and I will be able to tell you more details once we hear from the establishment in what direction are they thinking. So far, everybody is simply conjecturing on how it should be looking like. What we do know is that Project Kusha is going to be, a big part of that. But apart from that, what about the other elements, the sensors, the other parts? Are they going to be indigenously built? Prime Minister said that this is going to be indigenously built, but we will have to wait and watch how it unfolds for more specific details. Otherwise, मैं हवा में तीर चलाऊंगी.
On that note, Swasti, we come back to another question by our subscriber Georgia Sira, who asks that what is happening in Bolivia and is it good for US?
Okay, now interesting. That's a very refreshing question. And I truly really appreciate these questions because they give me a chance to actually talk about something which opens up our geopolitical spectrum. And actually, that's the essence of geopolitics. Okay. So thank you for asking that question. Actually, what is happening in Bolivia is something which is extremely crucial for Latin American continent and the Latin American countries. It's just that because because it's a very far away theater for us, so we tend to not give it any attention, and we don't really have deep ties with countries in the region except for Brazil, and of course last time we discussed Argentina, but
Right.
otherwise we don't talk about that continent enough. So thank you for asking that refreshing question. Now, in terms of what has happened, in short, what has happened is that Bolivia, after 20 years of leftist rule, so for 20 years the Labour Party ruled Bolivia in different capacities. There is a lot of drama out there. And in those 20 years, their economic situation worsened to a point that Bolivia was on the brink of a civil war. In fact, every day there was some news of protests, killing, looting, plundering, chaos, and it seemed as if the country is going to, break into a civil war. And then finally, the elections happened on 17th of August, and the results of the 17th August elections, after 20 years, 2 decades, we see a right a candidate, or the right party is winning. We still do not know who the candidate is, because now these two right candidates, one from the Conservatives and one from another Conservative party, now these two guys are going to have a runoff in October, and one of them is probably going to become the president. Now, will it be good for US? It will be good for US, and I'll just give you, a couple of minutes, if you allow me. I'll give you some elaboration. It is just so strange that Bolivia for many, many years had a stunning, GDP growth and a stunning, economic markers, because they have a lot of natural gas and they have a lot of lithium, and especially their success story, okay, in the last 20 years. So basically, when Morales came to power in Bolivia, what he started doing, and he was the first non-white president, and obviously he was the first indigenous guy to become a president, and he had a lot of maddening support from the Bolivians. But long and short is that initially his formula for success was that the massive natural gas reserves, he started selling them particularly to Brazil and Argentina, and a lot of money was made, in the process. What he started doing, that he started basically using all that money for public spending, giving subsidies, public spending and all of that. And as long as the exports were doing fine, this model worked fine. But once the exports did not do as well, because over time other countries also diversified, and because in those years the Bolivian leadership had never really paid any attention to building resilience in their economic model, trying to do something about the lithium reserves, or basically trying to do any structural reforms. So the public spending continued because you want to keep the voters on your side, but then you had no money. So basically you started accumulating a lot of debt. And then finally you just, the Bolivians ran out of all their dollars and there was no money, and that is how the economic woes had started to worsen. And then, Morales was also exiled for a while. Then Morales put his own man, and this own man became very, authoritarian. And then Morales came back, and then they started having a power struggle. So there was a lot of drama, really. Frankly, I would love to do an explainer on it. Okay, but long and short is that after 2 decades, and the Bolivian public and society is so fed up of both these guys. So both these guys are barred now, and they put their own successors, and the Bolivians said that no, we don't want you, we don't want your successors, and that is how the right have now come back. Now, what had happened when Morales became president was, the minute he became president, he expelled the American DEA, the Drug Enforcement Enforcement Administration. So he sort of closed that office and he sent them back because he said that these guys are interfering. Okay, and as a result, his relationship with with the US had really started to sort of suffer, okay, because he said that no interference. And now, with the return of the right, they have a very elaborate economic reform. They want to sort of build more resilience, better competition. They also want to now create leverage from the lithium reserves, etc. So they have, elaborate reforms. In fact, both the parties. And then, in the same vein, I can argue that you will see a kind of a reset with the US ties, because if you remember, one of their formidable neighbors, which is Argentina, I mean, how cozy and warm and great their ties with the US have become after Milei has come to Argentina. And remember that Milei has also come almost on the same basis, which is that he's a conservative, and he said that I will come and revamp the economy, and he actually did it. Bolivia is also going to perhaps follow that kind of a model. And these elections had a huge presence from the EU election observers, because many previous elections have been allegedly rigged. And there, I mean, it's an open secret out there. So I don't have the time to get into the details of how the Organization of American States have, brought out reports where they said how Morales has went on, rigging elections, etc. How he's gone on, basically turning the entire country upside down for remaining in power.
On that very fascinating note, Swasti, our subscribers have a question on India-US ties, since we are discussing
Actually,
US. And
yeah.
Nu Ahmed has a question, and even Subhashish Dash has a question on, the current geopolitical situation and how India will balance its ties with US amid the whole chill in relations that is happening. And Noor Ahmed wants to know, why is India not focusing on UAE instead of China?
Okay.
And I'll club a few other questions together where another...
I read there are a lot of similar questions,
similar
right?
questions.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I feel like we can, take up all of them in the same combination. And I think this will also kind of answer the question that Vinay Kumar has in this context, where he says that should we then align more to United States to get technological advancements?
Now, I understand where all this is coming from, and trust me, I mean, literally right now, everybody's talking about the same thing, which is that India-US strategic partnership has been thrown under the bus. And what we see instead is that India is cozying up to China and Russia. And this is how the grand situation is looking like. So, because India was treated badly by Donald Trump, India is now going back to China, etc. I don't think it's that simplistic, even though it looks like that. So, one thing we need to clarify is that this is not a game of substitution. It's not that because we are treated badly by the US, we are going back to China. I mean, India-China has structural foundational issues, right? India-China LAC issues are
Boundary
structural,
issues.
they are structural. Also, not just that, India's long-term challenge is China. And it's not just China, Pakistan, which is backed by China, okay? So those long-term challenges aren't going anywhere. But having said that, what has happened in the current times, yeah, in fact, I've myself argued that when Donald Trump was becoming president, there was so much excitement in India about Donald Trump becoming president, और इतनी खुशी थी, लग रहा था वो हमारा president बन रहा है. I mean, I'm just saying that that was the overarching sentiment, that Donald Trump will come, and with the Republican administration, everything is going to fall into place. Now, while of course that was very ill-founded, but I will just be short, because one can talk about this for hours, and you can just pick up any of the worldviews that I've recently done. I mean, most of these discussions have been on what has happened between India and the US and what are the reasons. But I'll just tell you very quickly. See, Donald Trump era has thrown challenges, and significant challenges, for India. Donald Trump has treated India rather poorly, okay? And India understands that as far as Donald Trump is there, it will be very difficult to have a healthy discussion either on trade or on Quad or on defense industry. So while I do not see that the orders that have already been placed will be cancelled, There was again a lot of reporting, and later on we realized that those were not really genuine reports.
Yeah.
But what we have seen is that there would be very little appetite in India to go ahead with a fresh, so to say, order, especially when it comes to the 414, 404 engines, because when you tie up with a country for engines, you're actually tying yourself up for 15, 20 years. And India actually shouldn't be doing that, considering just how unpredictable America has turned out to be. And it's not just Donald Trump, it's also the elite out there, the political elite, that have suddenly changed their tone for India. So I do agree that in the longer term, we will see that convergence coming back, because long-term challenge for the United States is China. And now that brings me to the question of Russia. In fact, there are many questions on this. Now, I think my reading of the situation, why Donald Trump is really cozying up to Putin so much, is basically coming from two factors. One is that he genuinely wishes to have a Nobel Prize, and he thinks that the
Once he
Ukraine war,
resolves this conflict.
yeah, and he needs to end the war in Ukraine. And to his mind, the best way to end the war in Ukraine is to basically cut a deal. And that's what he's doing. But the more he wants to cut a deal, the more he realizes how complex the situation is. But his entire endorsement of President Putin is done because he wants to convince President Putin to end the war, and he feels that he's ideally placed to do that. And that is why he keeps saying from day one that it is Joe Biden's war, and had I been the president, there would never be a war. So I don't think that America doesn't think that Russia is a long-term strategic challenge, but what it's the one is the Nobel Prize desperation, and he thinks that by talking nicely to Putin, he can convince Putin to end the war so that he, Donald Trump, can get a Nobel, number one. And number two, why Donald Trump is cozying to Putin and Russia is because that is the only way that he can literally shake the Europeans out of their slumber of the peace dividend years and holiday from history, because there was no way under the sun that anybody could have really made Europeans start spending so much on NATO commitments and so much of percentage of their GDP on defense. I mean, what is happening in Europe today, I keep repeating it, the conversations have radically changed, and the only credit goes to the Trump bill, okay, that he came and he literally changed the rules of engagement. So I'm not trying to say that he did a great thing. All I'm trying to say is that a part of his cozying up to Russia is also to ensure that Europeans do not really behave like freeloaders, because if you remember, J.D. Vance actually said that in so many ways, and also at the Munich conference. So basically, just to sort of circle it back to the argument that we were having, is that I am of the opinion that Donald Trump is in a hurry to end the war in Ukraine and basically to push Europeans to pay for their security, which they were not doing earlier, and also convince his MAGA fan base back home that he is no longer sending free money or free weapons to Ukraine. In fact, he is actually selling them so that money is pouring back into America, making America great again. When it comes to China, I think the long-term challenge remains China, and you may very well see, because it is Donald Trump and you can never be sure about what his next move is going to be, but it is very much possible that once this Ukraine question is settled, the way he wants to settle it, which means with a Nobel, okay, he might as well, double down on then tackling China. I think he is a shrewd businessman. He sees everything with the lens of profit and loss, and he doesn't really care about ideology or history, and that is his trademark style. From India's perspective, India also somewhere has to understand that for Donald Trump, ending this war in Ukraine because he wants a Nobel, etc., is something which has become much of a priority, and India is not a priority. But having said that, Donald Trump ke jaane ke baad bhi America rahega. So with respect to what is happening with China, India is basically managing its ties with China. India, all the tactical developments that you are seeing are not shifts. They are managements of a very, very complex question, especially after what has happened during Operation Sindoor, and we saw China coming out openly in support of Pakistan. In fact, just after Wang Yi finished his visit here, he went to Pakistan, and they'll be having a Pakistan, Afghanistan, China trilateral. The second iteration of it in Kabul. The first iteration happened in Beijing in May, just a month after the Pahalgam attack. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that none of those things have changed. Some bit of tactical rapprochement is important because we need to buy time. We need to ensure that while geopolitics is in such a flux, we need to ensure that we don't enter into some kind of a shooting match or some kind of a border standoff, etc., with China. With respect to quickly Russia, I think the writing is on the wall. The sentiment in New Delhi and in the strategic circles is that it doesn't make any sense for India to alienate itself from Russia. for somebody like a Donald Trump who remains to be so unpredictable. And while if you genuinely ask me, I do not see a kind of a shift in India-Russia relations anyway. Russia's ability to give weapons to India is still limited because most of its efforts are still focused on the war in Ukraine. Russia is important to us for our energy security, and if you see carefully, government has neither given a yes nor a no to the refiners, right? The government has said that you are free to decide what you want to do. I mean, that is how I read it. It is good that India has stood up to, to Donald Trump, because everybody must always stand up to bullies, okay? So India has done the right thing there. But having said that, in terms of Russia, we also have to understand that Russia was always important to us. I mean, I don't think anybody in their right minds would argue that India should end its relationship with Russia. It's just that in the prevailing circumstances, it looks as if it is coming on a rebound, okay, which I understand where this is coming from. If you ask me from my objective lens, the way I look at it, Russia will still have little weapons to give to India in the short term. We are still waiting, by the way, for the two S-400s. Remember that, okay? We are still waiting for the remaining two S-400s. We are still waiting for the rupee-ruble mechanism to work well. So those issues remain. But you do see that there is an increased, diplomatic flurry with, for example, the, NSA Doval going to Russia. Now Dr. Jaishankar traveling there. Then Prime Minister is supposed to meet President Putin. So all of this has to be looked upon in a positive light, because India is hedging its bets, and at a time when the global order is so uncertain, India should hedge its bets. Does it mean that there is a paradigm shift or not? I wouldn't jump the gun and say there is a paradigm shift anywhere. So far, I have not seen anything really cancelled anywhere, and I personally would say that India is trying to ensure that whenever times get too uncertain, India's national interests are not really affected, and therefore India is trying to diversify. And before I come to the other part of the question, there was a little question asked to me about should India engage the US for technology, etc. See, there is no doubt about the fact that United States is a global pioneer in technology, whether it's military technology, whether it's cyber capabilities, whether it's semiconductor capabilities, etc. And there is no doubt about the fact that India has benefited a lot from the last 25 years with its relationship with the United States. The trade figures speak for themselves, okay? The trade figures of $212 billion worth of bilateral trade between India and United States, which is in our trade surplus, they speak for themselves, okay? But having said that, it makes sense for India to keep it as diversified as possible, especially when you see that Donald Trump is sort of elbow twisting you and for lack of a better word, insulting you like that. So no sovereign country should be taking that. And I think that's where the second part. You are right when there is a question on why is it that India is not engaging the middle order powers. It is true. I agree with your reading that there is way too much obsession with looking at the world in terms of US, Russia, and China, and as if India's relationship with other countries, does not matter. In fact, I would argue on the contrary. What you have today is a very, very curious situation where even though US is the world's biggest military power and the world's biggest economic power, it is looking inwards, right? You have a China, which is the world's second largest, economy in many ways. Although the second largest economy by GDP is the European Union, but let's talk about countries first. So talking about, China, you still have structural issues with China. When you talk about Russia, Russia is a fairly small economy. Russia is a 2 trillion economy, which is really mired into its long-standing war of grinding attrition in Ukraine, and one doesn't know when it ends. So there are limitations, and you have a global order today where there is no global security guarantor. Okay, and with the retreat of United States as the global security guarantor, it is not true that China is filling that void as a security guarantor. China is there in its own way. Sometimes it's an economic player, sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it tries to change the status quo unilaterally. But you cannot argue that China is stepping into the United States' shoes by presenting itself as a global security provider, okay, or a guarantor. Therefore, you have a situation in geopolitics today where there is an emergence of middle order powers with cross-cutting defense value chains. This is a phrase that I keep using these days because this is what I'm working on these days, and it is really sort of very, very intensive and hard work there. But this is the global order that you have today, where a lot of middle order powers are emerging, and those middle order powers in many ways are France, UAE, Israel, India, in many ways, and they have cross-cutting defense value chains. So the situation you have today is that you have to engage not just the big powers, you also have to engage, and in a sustained manner, all these other powers as well.
So with that, Swasti, I think you have kind of also answered Ravi Rule's question, where he asked that, do you think that the Trump administration and what US is doing is a sign of the end of the unipolar world, and that the Trump administration is looking at a G3 model of modus vivendi with China and Russia, which we discussed in details.
Yeah, so I mean, I've already answered that question, but I'll just tell you that yes, you are right. I mean, now you can connect it with my other previous elaboration that indeed we are living in a world where there is a retreat of United States as the global security provider and guarantor, and therefore it's not only usurped by a country like China, but what you see is the rise of the middle order powers, and therefore India must. I totally share that, and I already said it, but I'll repeat anyway, that India must work out a modus vivendi of looking at developing ties with all kinds of powers, and we will see how it goes, vivendi, and we will see how it goes. So that was a good question. Thank you.
And with that, we come to an end of this episode. Please stay tuned for the next episode, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.